So in the previous video, we talked about the idea of randomness and that it's actually a good thing for us to see when we're taking a sample. What I want to talk about next is already a somewhat misunderstanding of the idea of taking the samples and saying that they're representative of a larger group. Many people come in with the idea that you can't have this small group of people represent a much larger group. So the thing that we're going to talk about here is the most important thing is to always keep in mind the goal, or why are we going out to collect this data. So the first thing that we're just going to remind ourselves of are the two terms population and sample. So they're ones that we talked about in video 1. So what is a population? So remember, a population is the entire group that we're interested in studying. Whereas the sample are the ones that we actually collect data on. So in one of our examples, our population was all Americans, but then we only sampled 1,000 Americans. So those 1,000 Americans would be our sample then. So we're going to talk about this fundamental rule for using data for inference. First off, keep in mind that I don't expect you to necessarily remember the fancy name attached to it. I want you more to remember the idea of this rule. So it says, if the data can be considered as representative with regard to the question of interest, this is where that why is important. The available data can be used to make inferences about a much larger group. So we're going to start this with an example. And going with your gut instinct to my question is, does Cincinnati represent all of the United States? For most of us, our gut answer, of course, would be no, right? That's one city of the entire United States. There's no way that Cincinnati could represent it. However, I'm going to argue with you that it matters what is of interest. So for example, if my goal is to find out the average height of men, I want to ask myself, could Cincinnati represent all of the United States? So here's the real question that we need to ask ourselves here. Do you believe people in Cincinnati are all that different than the rest of the United States? And that's not all I'm going to say, because that's no context involved yet. So, do you believe people in Cincinnati are all that different than the rest of the United States when it comes to height? So does the fact that we live in the Cincinnati area affect our height? Do you know that only exceptionally tall people live here? Do you know that only exceptionally short people live in Cincinnati? Well, from what I know, I don't really believe that they're different when it comes to height. So if that's what I believe, then I'm going to believe that Cincinnati is probably representative of the U.S. heights. Right, so taking into account what I'm actually measuring. So I think that Cincinnati can represent U.S. heights. So again, that heights is the idea of keeping in mind the why. So what are we actually doing? Now, if instead I was interested in the average commute time, again, my question would be is if Cincinnati could represent all of the United States. So the start of my sentence is going to look just like here. Do you believe that people in Cincinnati are all that different than the rest of the United States? But how I finish it is now going to be related to this. So when it comes to commute times. So see, all that I changed compared from this sentence to this one is what we're measuring. So when it comes to height versus when it comes to commute times. Now, do you think the area in which you live, so the fact that someone lives in the Cincinnati area, would affect their commute time? Yeah, I probably do. I mean, your geographic location does really affect how long your commute time is. So then I would say that Cincinnati could not represent U.S. commute times. So notice that we talked about the same idea with both though, right? If I were to just sample Cincinnati versus all of the United States, so both of those, the instance is the same, but it does boil down to what am I actually measuring? And so does the way that I'm taking that sample impact the type of results that I would actually get? So before you jump to the conclusion that a smaller group can't represent a larger group, this is what that main question that we need to be asking ourselves is, the people that I'm sampling, are they really all that different? Do I have this strong expectation? So for another example, if I wanted to find out how people felt about a smoking ban, and I decided, well, I'm just going to go to the smoking sections and sample people there. Do you think their opinions are going to be all that different than the rest of the people? Does them being a smoker influence the fact of how they're going to feel about a smoking ban? Probably, right? So I need to talk about this idea of, keep in mind the goal, what am I measuring and on who, and is the one affecting the other or not?